Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Okay. So all of you have an interest in qualitative research. Okay. So I've just went around. My name is Govender, and I've done qualitative and quantitative research. So it's interesting to give you a perspective on both. But the focus of this seminar is on qualitative research. Just a brief conversation with some of you here. You are interested in doing qualitative research as part of your thesis, and how you think about qualitative research. Let me ask you this question. When you think about qualitative research, what comes to mind? It's a free thinking exercise. Yes?
From my perspective, it's always about finding the respective experiences of people. So it has to do with interviews more than anything.
Okay, all right. Experiences, that's a useful term. Okay, something we tick off. Any other concepts or phrases that come to mind when you think about qualitative research? Yes?
Information needs unpacking.
Lots of information requires unpacking. So we're talking about a richness of information. Okay, that's interesting, right? Okay.
Subjective nature of the research.
Okay. We start to get into these to that area which is complex or qualitative research, where we talk about this term subject, and the antonym for subject is object. So there's this dualism that we have to kind of navigate in qualitative and quantitative research. Interesting. Okay. Other terms that you think? Yeah.
Information through interviews,
Observations, interviews, talking about methods, right? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also a sense of meaning, trying to get the meaning from the respondents.
Wonderful. Meaning. Okay. Meaning-making processes. Okay. So you get a sense that, you've kind of alerted me to these kind of concepts that form part of, if you had to do a kind of a mind map, these words occur and come across quite often when we're doing qualitative research. Meaning processes, data that has a richness and a in-depthness into it. There's particular methods that are associated with it, interviews, observations, and we talk about this kind of personability aspect, subjective and objective, and how we kind of navigate that. So, in a sense, qualitative research is about the method, but it's more than that, isn't it? From what you're saying. It's talking about a kind of a philosophy and a way to approach a particular issue. It's a mindset. It's a particular mindset and a way to that we arrive at something. So I ran a workshop with a colleague on qualitative methods a week ago from University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and we did a week on qualitative methods. So I'm going to use a couple of these slides, and we went through we had time, 5 days, to get into the nitty-gritties of qualitative research, but to take you through a tour of some of the basic issues. I think what's important for qualitative research, from the outset I have to say, don't get stuck in the method. The method lends itself to an approach. Rather, qualitative research and quantitative research should be about framing an approach and a way of thinking. Because if you don't do that, what tends to happen is that you get stuck in a method, but without a guidance to what informs the method, a rationale for it. And I'll come back to some kind of philosophical principles about knowledge construction and research and why it's important. And remember, when we are working in the social sciences, the mother discipline of the kind of sciences is philosophy of science. That's the premise we start from in thinking about how we navigate knowledge generation and the knowledge production process. And when we think about that in kind of broad principles, we are able to place the types of research that we do. And there's a word for it called epistemological, means our engagement with knowledge out there and how we produce that knowledge. And for different research methods and techniques, there's different ways that we can approach this. We're all familiar with quantitative work, and we know terms like objectivity, deductive reasoning. Qualitative research works against those assumptions. So it's important when you're doing an academic thesis is to think about the rationale and framing. Once you understand the kind of broad principles, then it's almost like you're swimming in a stream of qualitative research. The other things become apparent soon. But if you go too quickly into the method, whether am I doing an interview or an observation, even in quantitative research, whether I'm doing a survey or a qualitative design, it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem because you don't have the philosophical constructs to navigate your approach to this. So it's important to think of that. So let's go through some basic principles that kind of talk to us about the character of qualitative research. So here's the thing about science in general. Irrespective of whether you're talking about qualitative or quantitative research, we've got to engage in the knowledge production process, right? And scientific knowledge is distinct from other forms of knowledge. There are many forms of knowledge in this world that we engage in. And scientific knowledge is only one part of that process. And scientific knowledge is characterized by certain types of ways we think about things. We pay attention to systematic knowledge, right? As opposed to non-systematic and chaotic knowledge. Okay? Knowledge has to be systematic. It has to be transparent and empirical. You hear the term empirical? Empirical means observations. It has to have a transparentness or accountability in the real world. So we engage in this process, and it has to be logically ordered. So scientific knowledge, whether you're talking about qualitative research, quantitative research, we've got to engage in those processes. And that distinguishes scientific knowledge from any other form of knowledge. We are interested in facts, and in particular in the quantitative kind of realm, we're looking at facts that are undeniable, has stability over time, is absolute, and is unbiased. And this differs, scientific knowledge differs from belief systems. Belief systems are ideals, they change over time, they can be contradictory, they can be individual, they can be sporadic. So when we, as students of knowledge generation, are interested in generating and working within the enterprise of science, we adhere to particular principles. Transparency is important because it allows for peer review, it allows for contestation, it allows for rigor. Important points, right? So science-based, very important. So we ask you when you write an academic thesis, what theory are you engaging in? Scientific practice is premised on theory. Theory is the foundational principles of scientific practice. Without theory, we cannot engage. We either develop theory in an inductive way or we test theory in a deductive fashion. So it's important for us to look at this relationship between theoretical theory and empirical observations. So when you're developing a research proposal, you're asked at some point, what type of theory are you using to try and understand an area that you're working with. Technical knowledge is not necessarily scientific knowledge. Okay? So technical knowledge about how to construct a plumbing system, to work a particular device, is technical knowledge. It's important, but it's not necessarily scientific knowledge. Get that? Scientific knowledge has to have a conceptual base that distinguishes it from technical knowledge. And really important, this is where we get to the method and why people get so obsessed with methods. It's established through formal and rigorous methods, scientific knowledge. And it's distinctive from politics and perspectives. We have a particular theory, we go out into the real world, we acquire facts, and we test this. This applies to both qualitative and quantitative research. Everyday knowledge is not necessarily science because it's not up to the test of transparency, of empirical facts, and of debate. Okay? So, scientific results are facts. Okay? Observations, we control, we are really paying attention to issues of biases. We have a criticality to it, and we have a logical reasoning. So in whichever paradigm you engage in, whether qualitative or quantitative, you've got to apply this kind of mindset. You hear these kind of comments that qualitative research is soft research, quantitative is hard and it's more rigorous. Not necessarily so. When you engage in a scientific enterprise, you engage on these common principles. Both are rigorous, yes?
Why do you think that's a perception that is so forceful out there? Because that's what you get all the time.
Yes,
For
yes.
instance, if you tell your supervisor that I'm only going to do qualitative, in most cases you get the response that says, no. Either you do both or you go quantitative.
There are perceptions about ways of doing research and certain. It's part of a historical trend. You know, there's been a hegemony in the kind of social sciences, and this is part of a historical thing where the quantitative sciences have had a lot of sway. If you think about post-Enlightenment period, and partly because it's a long history. You know, quantitative sciences had such an influence in the natural sciences, and when the social sciences were taking root, what did they do? In search of a methodology, let's look over at our neighbors in the natural sciences and say, wow, there's a method that they're using that works, let's import this. But over time, we'll be seeing that the social sciences are much more complex. The quantitative kind of perspective only gives you one angle. So it's been a kind of hegemony of the kind of quantitative positivistic sciences, positivistic is more appropriate term, with kind of a resistance. We've hit a kind of ceiling with the positivistic sciences in terms of understanding human and cultural behavior. And we know that, right? We can only go so far. Hence, with the post-Enlightenment period, we've seen a new kind of emphasis on humanism. Know what I'm saying? About understanding people in context. But it's come with the rigor as well. So it's partly a perception, and a perception that we slowly kind of chipping away in academia. And you're seeing it more in the last 20 years, more journals devoted to qualitative research. I had an engineering student last week in the qualitative course, because it's impacting on their field as well. But it's still, again, work in progress. Okay. I mean, but the important point to note here is that when you engage in a scientific practice, there are common principles that you've got to work with. And those common principles I've indicated, right? So it's the criticality and the way you position yourself. So, what is qualitative knowledge? It's knowledge that we're trying to kind of access on a phenomenon. Now, in the social sciences, we are aware of this. It's very difficult for us to take an issue like what type of research you're doing. Give me an example of research that you're working on. Anyone working on a research topic here?
Training and development.
Okay. What's the topic area of your research?
I'm actually looking at how training and development helps performance.
Training and development helps performance. In which area? Is it a specific area?
Actually looking at pedagogic knowledge and content knowledge.
Okay. All right. Any other examples? Yes?
Social entrepreneurship.
Social?
Entrepreneurship.
Okay. Which area? Is it small enterprises?
Yes, small and medium enterprise.
Right, okay. So if you are looking at these issues, you would agree with me, it's very difficult to understand these issues without understanding the context in which enterprises occur or which training and development occur. There are particular contexts. You would agree? So it's very difficult to undertake research without understanding the social constructs that make up a particular context. Context is really important to how social norms are developed and operate. Is that a reasonable assumption to make? If that's a reasonable assumption to make and we can't get away from that, we need a method to be able to help us access social context in all the work we do. Why? Right? Because social context is the foundations for how we understand a particular phenomenon in the world. Hence, we cannot context strip. You know what I'm saying about that? We cannot say, I want to look at this phenomenon called entrepreneurship. I'll take it from the context. I'll put it here in a laboratory. I'll put on my laboratory glasses and try to do an analysis of this. Does that make sense? That's what the quantitative paradigm has done. That's imported from the natural sciences. We can't do that. For us to understand it, we got to go into the context and understand the phenomenon within the context. Yes? It poses some challenges, definitely, for qualitative research, and that's why qualitative research has to be rigorous. But nevertheless, we have to engage in that social milieu. If we don't do that, we're missing out a lot of information. So the point about trying to get, the word philosophers use is a term called emic, being in the context as opposed to ethic. Ethic means taking a step back, being objective. Emic means immersing yourself in context. So a key phrase in qualitative research is, how does one immerse themselves into a particular context? To be able to, first, what's the first thing to be able to do? Starts with the U. To understand. To understand a particular phenomenon before you are able to describe. Quantitative research, there's a tendency to describe quite quickly. And that's why we say here, the approach is more governed by frequency and measure and prevalence. I've been trained as a quantitative researcher, so I understand that quite well, the kind of the urgency to be able to describe. And it has its own strengths. So the point about quantitative and qualitative research, and if you take a step back into the kind of philosophical paradigms between positivism and interpretism, social constructionism, is that they talk past each other. It's very difficult to compare them using a common standard. It's like talking about apples and oranges. The two ships shall never meet at midnight. They always pass each other. Why? Because they begin on different philosophical principles. So if they can't agree on that, then... So if you engage in a particular paradigm, I mean, you're working with particular things. In more kind of eclectic forms of research, we find people combining qualitative and quantitative for pragmatic reasons. But if you go really back into the kind of the ways about thinking, then there are certain things that they never agree on. And so we talk about a method based on what we want to do. So if we want to immerse ourselves in context to understand practices and behaviors and phenomena, then we use a particular method. And the thing that you should not be able to do is to crisscross methods. Does that make sense? Use qualitative research, but argue at it from a there you go. To argue it from a quantitative point of view, that's not going to help you, because you're always going to run up a dead end. Also using quantitative work and using qualitative research to criticize it. Again, you're not up. You got to embrace the principles within the paradigm to be for you to engage it in a particular way. So your question is, why am I using qualitative research in my project, in my thesis? What's the point of it? It shouldn't be the issue about, I'm doing qualitative research because I need to do an interview. Get that, right? There has to be a particular question that you're wanting to understand that only qualitative paradigm can offer you some insights into. Similarly in a quantitative phase. So does that make sense? Hence, I'll go back to my first point about having a rationale, and then the method becomes apparent. Don't run to a method. Whether I'm doing an interview or a participant observation or a narrative study, park that for a bit. Ask yourself, what do I need to know about this phenomenon I'm researching? And why do I need qualitative methods to help me as opposed to quantitative methods? If you're clear on that, other things become apparent. Otherwise, you're working in a maze. If you're not understanding and sorting that rationale out, it's like you're in a maze waiting. You come to a point, and I don't know which turn to take, and I need some direction. Partly because you don't understand the maze. Does that make sense? So understand the maze of qualitative research, understand quantitative research, and then and when you begin to swim in the stream of qualitative research, the assumptions come. You start to warm up to the area and you think in a different way. Thinking in a different way is that, even if you work in quantitative. So this, I suppose, summarizes this in a way. It says about qualitative research is about words, images, practices. And you see in more recent times, a lot of qualitative research uses visual forms. Photography, photo voice, so giving more validity, authenticity to the kind of phenomenon we're researching. Quantitative research, numbers and frequencies, how many we're trying to quantify. So again, just even though they talk to this, just remember which paradigms or houses that they come from. So here's the thing about the type of knowledge that we're trying to understand for qualitative research. It's holistic. Get that? Detailed, in-depth, natural environment. That's really important. Okay? It reflects on your reflections on groups, peoples of individuals. So that's what we're trying. We're trying to get into a kind of in-depth way of thinking about this. Here's a point. It's their understanding and interpretations of their life, of the phenomena that you want. You're trying to access your participants' views, their construction of meaning. A particular way, a particular kind of school of qualitative research is social constructionism. Have you heard of the term? Right, okay, so it's a particular school, so constructions of meaning, you hear this term, narratives of meaning, understanding, interactions. So, and it's not easy to do this work because it's challenging, because the point about it is, it comes back to the point that you've made earlier on about subjectivity. To be able to do this, we've got to have a separation between your belief systems and the way you think about things when we try to access others. The difficult space. Can you see that?
Can you combine those?
It's a good question. Okay? In quantitative research, we have an instrument, right? In the very natural sciences, our instruments could be, for instance, yes. They are separated from the individual. We apply the instrument to an individual or a phenomenon, we get a measure, and that measure is seen as an objective measure on a metric system. Qualitative research becomes more difficult. Where is the instrument situated in qualitative research?
The person who is doing the...
So you become the instrument most often. That produces a particular challenge, doesn't it? Why does it produce a challenge?
The information you receive interacts with your beliefs,
There you go.
your prior knowledge, and
There you
something
go.
else might
There
come
you go.
out.
So, what does that mean for you in terms of producing knowledge using a qualitative approach? Puts a lot of rigor and discipline on the perspective of the researcher. To be able to undertake this process of ensuring that what they gather is, you need to process it in a reflective way. Does that make sense? It's not, so that's the challenge for qualitative researchers, is to engage in the process of reflexivity, to be able to look at the work and saying, hey, how much of my bias and belief systems go into this? Not easy to do. That's the rigor and that's a challenge. This notion of subjectivity or intersubjectivity between researcher and what's known. This epistemological kind of reasoning of how do I interact in the world in terms of the knowledge. From a quantitative perspective, it's clearer because you try to maintain objectivity. You try to be deductive. You try to make the separation between the subject and the object. In qualitative research, it's more difficult. So there are other ways that we can approach this to ensure, again, that we meet the scientific principle of rigor, of empirical data, of being critical, and our knowledge being of value. So it's important. If you don't engage in this process of being critical about the type of data, then it becomes, you get into a loop where you can't separate your value systems from what you try to research. It becomes an epistemological kind of problem. So the one term that we use often in qualitative research is inductive. Have you heard the term inductive? What does inductive mean?
Theory building.
Yes.
You allow the theory to evolve from the work that you're doing or the study that you're doing.
Okay. So it's bottom up. It's immersing yourself in context, trying to bracket your belief systems and understanding inductive. And inductive is useful for theory developing. We're trying to understand phenomenon, trying to understand the kind of banal workings of life and how does this impact. And we can use it to develop concepts and to develop working hypotheses of how social life operates. Quantitative research, it's a very deductive way of reasoning. We have hypotheses with variables, and then we engage with it. Okay. Prof. Harold will tell you about quantitative research and the importance of setting hypotheses, very formal and very kind of, upfront for testability. Qualitative research operates a slightly different way. Yeah.
I mean, using the qualitative research to inductive studies, I mean, actually you build up, as you said, a sort of a theory. And then from there, you can set up a sort of a hypothesis as well.
Yes.
And when we do this mixed method, is that the start point for the end of the qualitative study and then testing the hypothesis with the quantitative one? Or
Sure.
Or maybe, I mean, I don't know, I mean, how is it structured when you do this mixed method?
When you relate the two.
Yeah.
Important question. So you could use it in different ways. You could use, if you don't understand a phenomenon enough, right, and there's not enough research, you may want to do an inductive qualitative. You may want to get into context, understand the phenomenon, spend a couple of months thinking about this, and then developing some working hypotheses. And that prepares you for a quantitative phase, where you want to do some sort of formal hypothesis testing in a quantitative way between variables. It could be the other way. It could be where the area is known and you want to test a hypothesis using a quantitative method. And then post that, you want to do some follow-up work to understand why the hypothesis was not significant. Depends again on your rationale. Okay.
So meaning when you have an exhaustive theory, then obviously, I mean, you use a deductive method to do the quantitative study, and then if all your research questions are not answered, or if you have a different outlook to the result that you get, then you can move to the qualitative study.
You could do that. It depends on the area you're working on. And again, what's your rationale? Again, if you're working in an area where there's not enough knowledge, where you're trying to understand, it's best to kind of go use a flexible approach to understand. And that may take years before you do quantitative research. Okay. Remember, quantitative research is more about testing associations between variables. It's a cause-effect mechanism in its most kind of sophisticated form. So here's the point I'm trying to make, right? About the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. One has a linear path. So you should be really clear about doing quantitative research, because it has a stepwise logic to it. So you need to be really prepared, and you need to be understanding your area well. Qualitative work works more in a kind of cyclic fashion. Working hypotheses, thinking about data, deriving a hypothesis, going into the field, thinking, is that hypothesis tenable? I do more qualitative research, I may orientate and rework my hypotheses. As you can see, the cyclic mode offers you more flexibility. And here's a quote from a particular author, that especially if you're working in a complex area, then this kind of cyclic approach is important. You're trying to understand a particular phenomenon. Yeah?
That's fine.
Fine?
I'll think about my question.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
My question is on this, the qualitative cycle. You have collect data before you identify the problem.
In the qualitative circle.
Yes.
It's just remember it's a circle. So you identify the problem, right? But you identify a problem. All research you could identify a problem before you start, right? You collect some data. You develop a working hypothesis. You come back. You refine your problem, and you collect more data and work. So it's a kind of iterative process. Okay.
I think that's my question was more
Yeah.
aligned to what is just asked.
Yeah.
As to on the side of the qualitative cycle, does it mean you can start anywhere? You know, all of those steps.
Importantly,
But I think you've sort
Yeah.
of highlighted the fact that you can start with the identification of the problem, but you can still go back again.
That's it. You always, for research, you always got to identify a problem. You know, don't go, otherwise you can't do research, right? You got to identify a problem. But in qualitative research, it allows you to define the problem. Because you may have a particular bias in how you identify the problem, right? So if you're working with entrepreneurship and SMMEs, you may have a particular problem that small businesses are not getting enough startup capital to be able to function appropriately, and that's your problem. We go into the field, and when you collect data, you may find, well, that may be the issue, but there may be other issues as well that add to the problem. So when you come back, it could be lack of skills capacity, lack of kind of social enablers for small. It's not only about monetary issues. And so you're going back and you developing a working hypothesis to say, well, if there's enough kind of social capacities, enablers for small, like the context has to be appropriate, skills have to be appropriate, there's enough support from government, technical capacity, those kinds of things, it's likely to lead to success. You're changing the way you see the problem. Get it? You're coming back and so it's a thinking process, and that allows you to kind of refine. So it's for qualitative research, it's important to be able to go to the context to help you define the problem as well. As opposed to quantitative research, you can see it's quite linear. Get that, right? So what does qualitative research do? What's the point about it? Descriptive accounts, we're describing. Similar in quantitative research, where you're doing a prevalence study of a disease, you're describing. In qualitative research, we can describe as well. We can just spend time describing concept theories and models, and so you're spending time trying to understand social phenomena and describe them. And you know, these are examples of kind of popular social phenomena that we work with on: gender, marginalized populations, social capital. I mean, this point about social embeddedness in the economy. So they're popular kind of areas that we focus on. The point about relationship between quantitative and qualitative studies, they can complement them. But they're looking at something different, right? Qualitative studies, you could be looking at entrepreneurship, and you could have a survey questionnaire to look at prevalence of particular businesses in an area and the activities they do. That's quantitative. Qualitative could ask, what are some of the kind of the social enablers for that type of work? So it's asking a different question, but it's complementary. We have pilot studies. Pilot studies are useful, helps to hypothesis generation, process, document process, it's important. Quantitative research is outcome, qualitative research is process. Follow-up studies. So that's the way we can think about how they quantitative and qualitative studies work. Basically interested in the fundamental character of a phenomenon, deep holistic understandings and perspectives. So when you phrase your research question, you're phrasing it in that way for qualitative research. Are we okay? I'm saying when we phrase our research questions for qualitative research, we phrase in terms of understanding, trying to understand the phenomenon, not trying to look at association between variable A and variable B, like we do in quantitative research, where we set up a hypothesis to test. Okay, so I've come back to this point about knowledge construction and paradigms of knowledge construction. You see that? Yes, okay. So it all relates to this point about working in different paradigms. If you have a look at this picture here for a moment, right? Can you all see that? If I asked you on a theme of women at work in Africa, if you take any one of those pictures and let's say here's a free thinking exercise. You're a staff reporter at a newspaper, right? And you went out into the field and you're working on this theme on women at work, and you have to take a couple of pictures. And you're asked to write a piece on this. What would your interpretation be on any one of? Let's take the example of the lady with the baby, right? The young child. What's your perspective on that if you have to write a piece? I mean, we don't have 10 minutes to write a piece, but just think through it. Somebody? Yeah. So you're a reporter. You that's a picture you take. Well, what story are you telling?
The challenges of working moms.
Yeah.
Challenges of working moms, right?
Work-life balance.
Right. Okay.
Openness of organizations to working moms.
Organization flexibility.
Right. Okay. Okay. Any other accounts that are different?
The impact on the child.
The impact on the child. Okay.
Home office.
Home office. Okay.
Maybe impact on productivity.
Productivity, yes.
Right. Impact on productivity. That's slightly different. Okay. So if we
Economic challenges.
economic challenges. So so the point is that if you're observing phenomena, the point about this exercise is that if you're observing phenomena in the world, and you would go out and observe the same phenomenon, right? You take a picture of that, but your interpretations are not necessarily the same. Can you see? Just in a flash here, we're having there's overlaps in the interpretations, but slight differences. The kind of there's interpretations here looking at gender and motherhood and challenges, interpretations on blights to the economy. So can you see that even though we all look at the same phenomenon, we don't necessarily come to the same conclusion. This is the point about your biases influencing how you see particular things. And you could take another, let's look at the picture of the woman in the field. What's your take on that? Think about it. Yeah.
Entrepreneurship.
Subsistence farming on
Right.
women.
Right. Okay.
Entrepreneurship.
Women entrepreneur.
Entrepreneurship, yeah.
Women as entrepreneur.
Entrepreneurship.
Survival.
Survival.
It's teamwork too.
Sorry?
Teamwork.
Teamwork.
Women empowerment.
Women empowerment, okay. So can you see again? Overlapping ways of thinking, but there's differences. Okay? So the point about this is that how you interpret, in qualitative research is all about interpreting. Description and interpreting and the way you see. And it's very difficult to have a blinker about the way you see things and report it. In a quantitative way, you're expected to look at the picture, and the quantitative paradigm says, we all see the same thing, so we report it in the same way. Can you see the problem with that? We can't all be objective, brute objectivity. It's not possible. There's always a perspective for it, and qualitative research acknowledges that, or the paradigm of interpretivism, big word, comes from interpret. Constructionism comes from the word construct. Allow us to say that we can see things from different perspectives, and enables the kind of differences of perspectives. And it's framed by how we think about the world. And this is the point about facts, and particularly social facts. Social facts are constructed. Do you get that? We, in the world of, when we're working in the social sciences, we spend time thinking about how we can understand facts. That's fine, but we've got to understand that facts are social constructions. A bank transaction is a fact, right? You go to the bank, we have a transaction where you deposit a slip and put money into the bank. But that's a social transaction. It's invented, it's constructed. So in human behavior, we have these kind of sometimes these slippages in the way we think. We construct these social facts, we put it out there, we stand back and think they have an existence separate to ourselves. They do, but not necessarily so. Does that make sense? We've constructed it. We think of a bank transaction. Think of registration. We think they have an existence completely independent of us. Not necessarily so. Social facts always work when, if someone from Mars dropped down on the planet and went to the bank and said, "What is this? I don't understand this. It doesn't make any sense to me." But to us as a society, it makes sense to us because we've created that way, that cultural practice. So cultural practices can be seen as social facts, but remember they're all still part of a culture, which means there's ways and deviations of different ways of doing things we need to appreciate. So this is the point about versions of the world. When we're creating social facts, and Emile Durkheim, the sociologist, pointed this out a long time ago, that we got to be careful and we got to be really cautious when we're thinking about social facts, engaging in the social sciences, that we have to be careful about how we think about these facts, because they have hidden value systems in them and moral judgments. Puts a lot of pressure and kind of responsibility on the scientists to be able to negotiate and think about it in a reflexive way. Does it make sense? So this is the points we made about paradigms, right? About scientific paradigms, interpretivism, which is associated with qualitative research, positivism, which is associated with quantitative research, and why science and philosophy are really kind of close partners, and science and theory. And all science has the kind of, science is the prodigal son of philosophy. Philosophy is a point of where we understand how we think about knowledge and how we think about our place in the world. Karl Popper is a good example of a positivist, deductive, quantitative scientist. And this point about how we work within science in a kind of logical, deductive way, quantitative science. And he uses this term falsification. The point about quantitative science is to falsify information. It's to test it. And it's associated with this kind of deductive phase, quantitative science, formulation of hypothesis, testing. Inductive is more understanding world. Folks, I'm getting to the end of this, and I'd like to have talk to you a little bit more about what are some issues you're having. Anything issues you're having with quantitative, qualitative science. Let's have a little bit of a chat about that. Is that okay? But these are the three main philosophical points about when you talk about paradigms to engage. Ontology. What's the nature of the reality that's being studied? I mean, all of us cannot get away from the ontological question in life. Religion spends a lot of time with understanding ontological existence. Our emphasis is epistemology, the nature of the relationship between you as a researcher and gaining knowledge out in the world. It could be in a very objective way, it could be in a very subjective way, depending on the paradigm you use. Make sense? And then from that, a methodology. So if you're working in the quantitative sciences, then you have particular ways of doing things, and in qualitative research, particular ways. Any questions thus far? Anything that comes to mind? There are no stupid questions or simple questions. It's a complex area. Yes.
Maybe it is a general question. Before you make a decision, which methodologies that you are going to use?
Yes.
What do you have to do? I mean, like for example, I mean, you have registered for a PhD, and you sent your concept paper for registration, and then you developed it to proposal, and you have to defend. Okay. And most of the time, I mean, everybody have made a decision what they are going to do, actually during the proposal stage, what method they are using and everything. Even before exhaustively looking at the theoretical background of their studies, So, I mean, in your opinion, what do they have? What do I have to do before I make a decision whether I'm going to use qualitative or quantitative or a mixed method for that matter?
It depends what you're working on, right? It depends on the area you're working on. You've got to ask yourself the question whether you want to test a particular hypothesis or you want to understand. I mean, a basic and a simplest, way to think about this. If the phenomenon that you're trying to understand is not well researched, and you're not sure about something, and you're trying to understand the context in which the phenomenon occurs, it may be more worthwhile to do a qualitative piece of research. If you're trying to understand prevalence, if you're trying to test a theory, a relationship between particular issues, then you're more likely to go a quantitative route. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. But my question is also, do I have to do a lot of literature reviews before I make my decision on the methodology?
Absolutely.
Or I decide and then I go for
No, you have to understand your
exhaustively
phenomenon.
do a literature review.
You need to be able to have confidence in being to know the area that you're working in and what type of approach is required. Do you remember I pointed about theoretical understandings? You need to work. And if an area is well researched, you may want to approach it from a particular angle. And that particular angle may be associated with quantitative research or qualitative research. It's how you think about it, and you're going to read a lot about the area you're working in. Be very clear and understand where the knowledge is. What's the status of the knowledge in an area before you decide where you want to go. I mean, you don't want to repeat work that's done. There may be over 20 studies in the area of entrepreneurship and small business enterprises, and you repeating that, that's not worth doing that. So you want to say what's the next step, right? And it may be a small step, but nevertheless it's the next step. And then you want to ask yourself, what do I want to do? The question. Before even you think about method, leave the method aside. What's the question I want to try to answer here? What's the problem? How I want to try to answer the problem. So you phrase the problem in a way, and then from that, think about a method that you want to. You can't do it the other way around. You can't go quickly to the method and come backwards. Okay, it's a dead end road again.
I'm using a mixed method.
Right.
And initially I thought I was using qualitative because I have to do interview before what you said. Now, before the question, there's a theory surrounding the topic.
Yes.
So the theory is actually helping me to unpack my identified gap. So my question now is it possible now, because of that, I'm using qualitative, but because I think I need to do interview, that's why I'm also using qualitative, so to make it mixed method. So if I want to use only qualitative, and already there's a theory, how do I build my idea? Am I going to form another theory, or am I going to test the theory that is already existing?
If you want to just do a qualitative piece of work, you're going to do qualitative research.
So I'm using mixed method.
But
if I want to do only qualitative,
yes,
because there's a theory already, and I'm using that theory to unpack what I'm doing.
Yes.
So if I want to do qualitative, because I think I'm using mixed method because I think I need to ask questions also, conduct interview. So if I want to do only qualitative, does it mean I will disregard the theory, use my idea to build another theory? Is that?
No, I mean, what's the area you work in? Let's put this in concrete terms.
Training and development.
Okay, training and development. So it's important to understand theories of training and development, pedagogy on training and development, where that has progressed in the last 5 or 7 years in an area, to understand where are the knowledge gaps. So you've got to kind of do a review of the state of the art of the evidence, right? So the evidence possibly goes up to there, and then there's a gap. We don't know. We know so much in the area, but that's the area that we don't know. So you'd want to insert your study in the knowledge gap. Then the next question to ask is, what area do you want to study in that? What evidence or what more knowledge do you need, right? And then the approach. What way, if the knowledge is, if you want to do a piece of research which is looking at testing a particular theory, understanding prevalence of a phenomenon, then you're more inclined to quantitative research. Not always, but more inclined. If you want to understand that a particular phenomenon in different contexts where you think there's variations and there's not enough known, and you need to insert yourself, then you're more likely to kind of go a qualitative route. or you can do both. So what I'm saying, it's depending on the kind of way you think about the problem identification. Spend a lot of time on problem identification, and the method becomes apparent. If you're spending too little time on identifying what the problem that you want to research, that's vague. It's going to impact, obviously, on the method. Get this point about problem identification. Problem identification, you get more confident about identifying a problem when you read. Yep. And these days we are fortunate. We can go to systematic reviews, meta-analyses that help us to tell us, to summarize the area. And they give you an indication. This is what works or doesn't work, or where the knowledge is, and this is the gap. And it helps us, points us the way to the problem. Problem identification, next step. How do I want to research that problem? Not going to the method and trying to come back. Right, you get into a spin cycle. Yes?
Earlier you said qualitative is descriptive. Do we have a standard way of giving that description?
It's a good question. I mean, in qualitative research, I say you're trying to describe often because you want to hold your biases aside. So at the basic level, you want to describe phenomena to start with. There's a point where you do work on interpretation, but you begin by describing, at least to try and make it as apparent as possible. And there's different approaches. So in a pragmatic way, you follow a particular author, a particular way of doing the analysis. And there are a number of ways of doing thematic analysis, or interpretive thematic analysis, or narrative analysis, or social construction analysis. There's a lot of schools of thought around that. Grounded theory is a popular one. So a particular way called inductive reasoning. So again, it's looking for an approach and saying, okay, I understand this approach. This works for what I want to do. And then aligning that method and way of thinking to helping you solve your problem. But it's not necessarily just applying something generic, because these approaches have nuanced ways of thinking about things. It's the same with quantitative analysis. You could do a regression, or you could do a structured, equation modeling. It just depends on the approach you take, with slightly different outcomes. Any other thoughts about this?
When we were chatting to him about the training and development bit, you spoke about, your theoretical framework and the theory. And, what happens sometimes where you find this theory that fits into your study so well, but there's also some criticisms around it. How do you work around that? Because, it lends itself to your study so well, but then there's other bits to it where you find some criticisms.
I think any theory is not above criticism, right? I mean, it's a theory, so it's a theoretical construct. It's also an opportunity, think about it, because it gives you a segue to position your research.
Yeah. You shouldn't really have that perfect fit, right? Yeah.
Impossible.
Yeah.
Theory is a way of understanding things, and there are many ways of understanding particular things. So you shouldn't be trying to solve the problem without doing the research. So if you have a theoretical model that explains everything, so why are you interested in doing the research? Does it make sense? So you have a particular phenomenon. If you're constructing a literature review, and you point out where's the knowledge in this area, but where the weak points are and the gaps, and that's where you'd like to pose your problem identification. you got to keep that clear. So for reviewers reading it, he needs to say, even if he doesn't understand the field, he needs to get a sense through your, even before, a good literature review, even before you come to your research question, the reader knows where you're going already. He anticipates your research question. He's not waiting for it, or she is not waiting for it. It makes sense. You're taking them to a narrative of where you think the status of the knowledge is and where are the particular gaps. And by the time you get to the research and the problem identification, it's not a surprise. Reviewers have problems with research proposals when it's all in a garble in the first, it's not coherent, and then suddenly a research question appears to them. They can't figure where's the bridge? Research question again becomes apparent. You need to know the area. You spend a lot of time, 70% of your time, understanding the area you're working with. And the problem identification is easier to phrase. Does it make sense? It's an important point. And people miss that point again. Spend the time looking at the body of knowledge, understanding where the gaps are. That helps you in terms of the problem identification, setting up your research question and your method. That can't be done quickly. Yes.
I just want to ask a question. Is there any particular level of knowledge in terms of quantitative or qualitative methodology that a researcher needs to have, which can influence their research topic or orientation? Because sometimes I understand there is that connection between what you want to study and your level of understanding about the methodology you want to apply to your study. Is there any, perhaps, advice, tips in terms of background and knowledge of research methodology one needs to have?
Again, it's this point has been said again about problem identification and knowing your area, and then methods. And then there are standard methods. If you're working in qualitative research, then you've got to think to yourself, okay, I'm undertaking a qualitative study, and what the best method for me to be able to understand the phenomenon I'm trying to work with? Is it observation? Is it going to be an interview? Is it going to be a structured, unstructured interview? Is it going to be a focus group? And they do slightly different things. Just depending on what you're trying to research.
Okay, because my understanding is that there are people that are more inclined or more comfortable doing qualitative or quantitative.
Sure.
And then, it just becomes easier if they do have.
It does, and people have an emphasis point, and that's, people preferences and things like that, and it's language. When you write in a qualitative way, it's different from writing in a quantitative way. It's a different way of thinking. So you can see that individuals prefer particular ways of doing things. Again, it's not to say that you can compare them. They just do different things, and you could look at the same phenomena and you come at it from completely different angles. So you're really approaching it. So they're complementary, but they're not. You can't put them on the same yardstick of measurement. So it depends where your emphasis point is. So it's not to say that one piece of research is less important than the other. It's an emphasis point, and you would have to think about where you want to locate that, right? Yes.
May I quickly ask this question? At the point of ethical clearance application in some schools, the ethical clearance department expects the students to submit the application with questionnaire, I want to know when is the appropriate time for a student to structure his questionnaire. Because is it after the literature review when you want to go to the field, or when you want to apply for article clearance? Because there's this confusion that you can structure your questionnaire while you're submitting your article clearance, or after you must have written your literature review. Which time is the appropriate time for that?
I mean, schools have procedures. I mean, Prof. Harold, you can have a more detailed conversation with him on those procedures and things like that. But, for ethics, just think about an ethics committee. They need to understand at a practical level what you are trying to do. Sometimes when you phrase a research question, it's an abstract way. So they need to look at an interview schedule or at least a draft survey questionnaire to get a sense of what you're going to do out the field. So the more information you give them, the more they can make a judgment on what you're trying to do. So I'd expect the review committees will expect you to have a draft questionnaire. But in terms of your thinking, I think that comes towards the end, because you need to go through the stages of problem identification, methodology, be really clear on all that, and the questionnaire is the end part of that process when you're clear about things, right? Even a qualitative interview schedule where you're putting issues, it all has to line up to your methods and your research question things. But it's important to give committees that information as well. They can help you see whether they are lining up. Yes.
On the follow-up question, I just want to know if you start with the quantitative research, then you end up with the qualitative research. So you find that all the responses, they were positive, but meaning that they agree that they are performing maybe according to what is normally known worldwide. Then now when you go deeper, for instance, you look maybe for the specific industry, let me say SME in agriculture, SME in retail, you discover that some they don't use that particular theory. Then is it advisable that you can go maybe ask those who don't use them for complementary to what you call as a complementary to find out what could be the rationale not to use that particular system?
Okay, so a couple of things to make note when you're doing combination qualitative and quantitative piece. Have a rationale. A methodology is different from method. A methodology is an approach. It's a particular approach, and you could have a number of strategies in you. If you have an eclectic methodology, then you're using qualitative and quantitative. You need to have a rationale though for why you're using both. And I say they work in different ways. You could say I'm using qualitative and a quantitative phase to do a test of a particular theory or hypothesis, and I'd like to use qualitative research as a follow-up, as an inductive process to understand some of the implications of this. Or you could swing it the other way and say, I need to undertake qualitative to understand this phenomenon, to develop a hypothesis for testing at a later stage. Does it make sense? So don't put these two things together without thinking through why and the sequencing of it. It's really important. There's some useful texts. The Creswell text, I think you're familiar with that? Talks about mixed methods designs. There are a lot of texts on mixed method designs. So you need to show a rationale for why you're using a mixed method. It's not just expect a reviewer to think that you're using it there's no standard way to use it. On the theory, for an academic thesis, it's really important you engage with theory. You're not writing technical reports. I work a lot in the world of technical reports, and technical reports, they get away from theory. And there's a tendency for them not to engage with theory, but you need to read academic literature to try to understand conceptual principles. So even if you engaging, for obvious reasons, if you're going into a work setting, they may not have an in-depth understanding of theory, but you pick that up in academic writings, and you need to kind of impose or work at theory to understand the work you're doing. You can't do a PhD without engaging in conceptual work or an academic piece of research. That's important. That's part of this thing called systematic knowledge. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, so this thing about mixed methods, it needs to be a rationale in your methodology and how you want to use it and the way you want to approach it. Don't just put it there and expect reviewers to understand that I'm just using a mixed method, therefore I can just mash it up together.
That is the attitude, I mean, in most of the advices that we get as well, because every method has got its strengths and weaknesses. And the mixed method is assumed that it will complement the other one. So it is always good, I mean, to use a mixed method so that you can avert the weakness of one with the other one. That is a perception there. But
sure, but you need a rationale, a methodological rationale for how you sequence it.
Yes.
Which you do first and why you're doing it.
But if your research question or if you achieve your objective with one method, why do you have to go for the next one?
That's a question you need to ask. Goes back again to problem identification.
Yes.
So it tells me that you're not clear on the problem. And
yes.
That's the point. It's not the method. The issue doesn't lie with the method. Methods are tools. We use them for different things, right? But if you're not aligning the method with the problem, it becomes a problem. So think about what's your problem and how would you use a mixed method to help you. It's a pragmatic way. I say a lot of pieces of research using mixed. It's not an issue, but it's an issue when you use it in an unreflective way. You place it there and you expect, especially in academic thesis, the reviewer will come back and say, okay, so why are you using this mixed method and why are you using this in this particular sequence? You need to have a logic for that. Because they work differently and there's text to help you to think through it. Okay, so I'm not saying don't do it. Just think about it more carefully and how it helps you with your research. And that's, you need to kind of look at it. Your supervisor will give you an indication, okay, I think a mixed method is useful. It helps insights, different insights, but you got to think about the rationale for that. Present that as a way. People, I'm coming to 10:2. Is there any other questions? How will we finish at? We done? When I'm done, okay, all right. Any other questions about combination research? And you clear about the? Okay, yes.
I'm trying to kind of have a clear understanding of what or which approach I'm going to use for my research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, because from my literature review, it seems as if I don't fall upon those two paradigms. My research is such that I'm going to be using secondary data, and I'm expected to develop an algorithm on things like that. Do I fall between qualitative or quantitative? I don't.
What secondary data are you using?
Like online data that have been collected in research centers already.
Right, okay. And what's your research question?
One of the research questions is how to determine or predict the treatment failure of a patient.
Okay, so you could do that in a number of ways. I mean, you could do that by looking at records, and that'll be possibly quantitative information. So you're looking at prevalence, or you could be doing interviews as well. So you could be using a mixed method. So the one perspective could get you prevalence about rates of treatment failure. But to understand it, you may not be able to pick that up through your secondary data. You may have to do some key stakeholder interviews to understand reasons. I'm just suggesting, I don't know enough about your work, but it may be you use a dual methodology. Okay. Is there any other last question one can take? Is it? Are we all okay? Okay, people, thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you go well with your research. Thanks a lot.